A good city is like an onion. You can just keep peeling it and never get to the center, never get bored. And I think Toronto's that kind of city.
Thank you so much for joining us at Toronto Island at Olympic Park right now. I understand this was your first ferry trip of the season down to the island.
It was, yeah. The inaugural trip across the harbor is always kind of fun because turn around and look at the skyline. It's like a great reveal of what's changed in the last few months since the last time coming over here. And every time it's different because the city changes by the day, it seems. So when you give it a few months and look at it all at once, it's always a bit of a kind of a shock and overwhelming and just a bit of awe.
This is an update to your original book, Stroll, that you did in 2010. What was the original idea for the book?
Yeah, the original book, I sometimes think about my first 10 years of living in Toronto. I moved here from Windsor, sort of always knew Toronto because you come here for the Phantom of the Opera, to go to Ontario Place, to go to the CN Tower, these tourist things. But then when I moved here, I realized this city's really big. I didn't really know it. I didn't know, where the streets led. I didn't know what was one neighborhood over. And so I started walking and exploring just for fun. And then that sort of morphed into a sort of quasi-job because I started writing about it.
Right.
And so I was writing for about 6-7 years about Toronto, and with Coach House Books put together the first book of walks through Toronto, explorations of Toronto. So I sometimes think of that, the first iteration of the book, as being my like thesis project on getting to know Toronto.
Why the update 14 years later?
Well, we always talked about updating it because talked about it kind of idly because the city's sort of changed and maybe on the 10th anniversary we'll do something. And then we were approaching the 15th anniversary and decided, okay, let's do it. And I thought it would be a couple months project, like this building's gone, add that building in. And I started with my young chapter walking from the lake up. And within the first block, I knew I was a bit in trouble because in that block alone from the lake, I could see like 14 new buildings. Huge landmarks were gone. Like the Toronto Star building is no longer the Toronto Star building. There was Captain John's seafood ship, which was a landmark floating on the lake. That's gone. And I was like, uh-oh, this is like the change in the city is way more dramatic than I thought. And it's sort of my job to pay attention to the city. And even I was taken aback by how much change there was. So this two-month project became an 8-month kind of odyssey of rewalking every step of the book.
So you have 31 walks that you cover in the book. What would you say is the biggest challenge in terms of the particular roads?
The biggest challenge was just the amount of territory I covered. For the first book, I had years to do it. Right, there are years of going out walking, years of digging in the archives, years of just kind of experiencing the city and then putting that into the book. I had to recheck all that like within a handful of months, and it reminded me also of how big Toronto is. We can see downtown behind me. Like that's the part that gets all the postcards and whatever. But the city's big. It's like 44 kilometers wide. That's like Los Angeles size. It goes on and on and on. And so to recover it, it was a lot of walking.
A lot of steps.
Yeah, it was good. It was good. Yeah, I recommend if you want to get your steps in, write a book about the city.
Fair enough. In the build-up to the book in 2010, what were your impressions of the city of Toronto?
Back in 2010, it seemed like Toronto was having a bit of a renaissance, maybe. It had been in the doldrums since the 90s. The 90s were kind of bad for Toronto. There was a devastating recession. Like we were looking at this building boom behind us, which started around 98, give or take. But there was like nothing built for 5 years. There were even like projects that were just like stumps of elevator shafts downtown. So there was that, and then there was amalgamation in 1998, which threw the city in disarray administratively, but also I think like spiritually. The city didn't know what it was anymore, and places like Scarborough and Etobicoke, places that had identities, suddenly didn't technically exist. So it felt like the city was just like thrown for a loop. And then through the 2000s, this sort of spirit of Toronto came back. The art scene really kind of flourished. There's a great music scene. The city started building up again. And there's like a sort of civic spirit and pride that started growing. So I think the book came out of that scene at the time.
I'm curious, with your latest strolls of the city, has that changed? Have new impressions of the city?
Yeah, so since 2010, I started writing a weekly column in the Toronto Star about Toronto politics. I love living in Toronto, but it's an incredibly frustrating place. Politically sometimes. Sometimes I characterize Toronto as being a teenage city. Look at it, it's big, but it's it's still so new that it's getting used to being a big city, and a lot of parts of Toronto don't accept that it's big, so we have terrible traffic, our transit system's not as big city as it should be, so we have all these growing pains. And so writing about this stuff on a weekly basis, I felt cynicism creeping in, which I didn't have originally. As well as the housing crisis in Toronto's grown, the inequality in Toronto's grown, we have other problems, really big looming problems in the place, in the city. And so those are in the book, but my publisher and I, we had to remind ourselves that there's a lot of good in this place. And doing these walks again reminded me that I do actually love this place.
There's a term that you use in the book, psychogeography. What does that mean?
Psychogeography is a way of exploring cities and space, really, landscape, that was started in Paris, in France, by the situationists, and they did all kinds of things. One of the things was psychogeography. It was a way of getting people to think about how they interact with the city, and sort of break people out of the routines and maybe ruts that they were in. So they would do things like go for a walk in Paris using a map of London. They would try to intentionally get lost. They have this really kind of beautiful, elegant way of exploring cities called the derive, or the drift. They would drift through the city without a destination in mind. Whatever, they came to a fork in the road, or an intersection, or an alleyway, and whatever looked enticing, they would follow it. And I realized when I discovered psychogeography, that's what I was doing. It was kind of really one of those wonderful moments when you see other people doing what you're doing. But psychogeography also has a critical edge to it. It's about exploring and discovering, but it's also about taking stock of things and saying, is this good? Is this equitable? Is this that? So it's kind of a wonderful way to explore, but also think critically.
We're in Center Island, going over the bridge to Hamlet's, correct? Is that the direction we're heading at?
Well, you go over the bridge, you go to Hanlon's to the west, Ward's Island to the east.
All right. Tell us the history of Toronto Island.
Well, Toronto Island used to be attached to the city. It was like a spit of land that came out, but there was a big storm in the middle 1800s and it got severed, which is now called the Eastern Passage to the harbor, and so then it became the Toronto Islands. There was an indigenous presence here, and then it became, when the colonial city was being built, this was sort of the escape for the city, and evolved into almost cottage country at Toronto's front door. So it became a populated place. There were little cottages, there were entire communities out here.
What does it represent for Torontonians? Again, cottages for a lot of people are out of reach. This is a popular summer spot. Look, it's June and this place is bustling right now.
Yeah, I mean, there's this whole idea in Canada and Ontario that the cottage, is this archetypal thing. Very few people actually own a cottage. It's out of reach, as you said. And so this is the cottage experience for most Torontonians, the most accessible cottage experience. And it's one of the reasons why it's incredibly important, incredibly precious to Toronto. It's why the ferry system, which is very romantic and old-fashioned, is great experience, but it's also a problem because it's really hard to get here. On a sunny summer weekend day, you have to wait a long time for the ferry. It's crowded, you're kind of penned in. The ferries are from the 1920s. They are ordering new ones, but they're going to be in the same style, kind of slow to get on, slow to get off. And so access to public spaces like the islands has actually become a critical issue in Toronto as more people don't have backyards. People live in apartments, condos. They deserve to have this kind of, a cottage experience in a public park. And so making this place more accessible is important.
you don't just walk Toronto. You've started walking through Windsor as well. What else can you discover through sort of walking cities? Windsor's your hometown, yet you say that you never actually walked through it.
Yeah, I mean, I grew up in the suburbs of Windsor, so I always had a car. Windsor's a car town. Mother worked at General Motors. And so I was in a car probably every day of my life until I moved to Toronto. And, Windsor's a smaller place. I always felt like I knew it, like the back of my hand, because I, lived there for so long. And then when I returned back home, which I do often, I realized after the first book came out that I didn't actually know Windsor. I knew it through the like a windshield, which is like watching a city on TV. You're kind of separated from it. So I've started in the last decade and a half going, like just parking the car in Windsor and just walking these places I thought I knew, but I only knew them from a car. And Windsor has revealed itself in so many different fantastic ways. A few weeks ago I was in Niagara Falls, and I was staying in the tourist zone right by the falls in one of the hotels, and I just went for a walk along the river to the old downtown, the kind of non-touristy downtown, and the crowds are all right at the falls, but you go half a kilometer away and suddenly you're in the normal city, and walked around the old downtown and the train station, and you can look across to New York State and see the train bridge going there, and then zigzagging through the city back to the tourist part, past the Niagara Falls Public Library, which is this beautiful 1970s building that I think is like, I didn't know it was there, and I think it's one of the best libraries in Canada in its design. And it was just like, oh, Niagara Falls. And it's a cliche that I've written about walking, but it actually works. It reveals the places we live in intimacy that you can't get any other way.
Do Torontonians really know their city?
Some Torontonians surely know their city, but again, it's such a big place that people say it's a city of neighborhoods, and which is a good thing. You can, I live in a neighborhood where I can do all my stuff in the neighborhood if I want. Go shopping, hang out, go to a restaurant, and so I don't have to leave it if I don't want to. And that's just like traffic might be bad in the city. I don't know, because I just walk around and do my thing. But I think the flip side of that is a city of neighborhoods is that people kind of become, they don't really leave their neighborhood as much. Maybe they go to work or they go to school, or a few friends live here and there. But the city, again, it's endless. It's like, again, 44 kilometers wide and pretty tall. And then it keeps going, right? There's the GTA too.
What would you say, of all the walks, you've seen the biggest change?
It was interesting. Some walks have changed more than others. Like the Finch Hydro Corridor didn't change that much, but there's new bridges. Like there's new connections. There were places where I had to walk all the way around. Now I can cross because the city's put in all these wonderful connections. But any of the walks that went through the kind of dense urban parts of Toronto, like Yonge Street, right? The way Toronto's zoned. We look behind me, we see all those buildings, and we talk about how quickly Toronto changes and how fast it's growing. But it's actually only growing in a few parts, right? It's zoned the Yonge Street corridor, the waterfront, other kind of pockets around. So a walk like Yonge Street goes through those zoned for change, and the landscapes are completely different. The literal, what I saw in 2010 is not what you see now, like entire blocks gone and new buildings up. So like Yonge Street, my chapter on the downtown east side, kind of zigzagging around, that's another really intense zone. So there's entire intersections. I kind of rewrote about certain intersections like Dundas Street and Church Street, which are radically different now. And that kind of change, I mean, that's partially why people are very nervous about the changes in the city, because it feels like the city that the city that you might have fallen in love with, is suddenly not there anymore.
So tell us a little bit about some hidden gems on the Toronto Island that you think people should know about.
Yeah, the islands have a very, they're busy parts, Center Island, the amusement park, the places closest to the ferry, some very formal kind of gardens, but then it gets kind of wild. Like there's some kind of forested areas, there's a hedge maze, of course, One of the things I really like are the modernist pavilions that date to the mid-60s. They were by Irving Grossman, architect. He did a lot of mid-century modern apartment buildings in the city. A lot of that Toronto 60s look was him and some of his contemporaries. But he built these pavilions, these kind of shelters that have washrooms and that sort of thing. And they're gorgeous. I mean, they could have been at Expo 67.
Right.
And they're still here. They're still intact. The Parks Department has done an all right job of keeping them up. So I think those are kind of hidden gems. I just kind of love the that kind of like the differences of this place, right?
Right.
From totally wild. The beaches, I think, are oddly a hidden gem, despite them being like
Interesting. Okay.
the draw, because I
Right.
think a lot of Torontonians still think you can't swim in the lake,
Right.
because back in the day you couldn't, or it was dirtier, and that kind of, it still has that reputation, but we swim at the island every summer. And
Surprisingly, one of the cleanest waters?
yes, it's a blue flag beach, which is an internationally recognized thing. And I know I'm going to sound like a Toronto booster right now, but it is like swimming in the Mediterranean. I think
Really?
you can swim out over your head and still see the ripples of sand underneath. Maybe a smidge colder. On the west side, which is it was always the more remote side, was Hanlon's Point Beach, which I think is the best beach because it's west facing. But it's also been the queer beach of Toronto. Toronto's first gay picnic happened there in 1971, so it's always been a sort of queer space because it's been a bit farther away from all the crowds, and now it's been clothing optional for 25 years. There's very few of those kinds of beaches in North America, so it's a very kind of unique space. Usually those kind of beaches are like far from the city,
Right.
but you can swim out on the beaches here and you just get beyond the tree line and then there's the CN Tower poking up. And so it's like, oh, the city and like what is like the wilderness, what we might think we have to travel far, far away, are all like right next door to each other, which is why this place is so special, which is why access to this place, equitable access, easy access, affordable access is really important.
What is good in Toronto by your estimates?
When I return to Toronto from somewhere else, sometimes like great North American cities that are famous, maybe more famous than Toronto for various reasons, and I get back to Toronto and I walk home or I get on the streetcar and I'm like looking out the College streetcar, and there's just endless critical mass of people. Like there's people everywhere, and there's human activity, and that is exciting to me. That I think, you know, a lot of cities, particularly North American cities, they have pockets, famous pockets where stuff happens. That's where the bars are. Here's the museums over here, and they get all the attention. They might be world-class museums and whatever. But Toronto just has this kind of continuity, endless continuity of humanity, of just human activity. And I think that is the thing I love about Toronto.
What needs work in this city?
I mean, I love Toronto, but it needs a lot of work. It needs a functional transit system. It needs, which I think is kind of coming. Like, again, we're in a very awkward time when, you know, we're waiting for subway lines to open. We've been waiting years and years. But there are big projects in the work, and I have to step back sometimes from the daily frustration and say like, oh, there is a new subway, downtown relief line, the Ontario line coming. Eglinton's going to open. The Finch LRT is going to open. Like, these things are going to, once they do open, it'll be like, oh, okay, things will click together differently. But yeah, the transit question, you have to, the TTC, the GO network, it's not good enough to get everyone out of their cars. People will still say it's better to be in my car. And so it has to be better than the car, because the car is never going to be the solution when you have this many people living together. It's impossible. It doesn't work in any city, only transit works. So there's that one. And the other part of it is the housing equity issue. Like, there's increasingly, Toronto was always expensive. It was always part of the narrative. Like, growing up in the 80s in Windsor, we'd hear what Toronto housing prices, $200,000 for a house? Oh my gosh. Whatever. It's always been, but it's kind of been exponentially hard. And like the stories of people leaving the city, of just not finding a place for them here is kind of dire.
Toronto Mayor Olivia Chow is concerned with the downtown revitalization. How can she best achieve that?
Yeah, when it comes to downtown, I sometimes think about what it was like when I moved here in 2000. The downtown was coming back after the recession, very busy place, but no one really lived downtown. There were no residential towers, like one or two, a few on the edge. City Place, the cluster of condos, which is around the CN Tower, and the Sky Dome were kind of coming. But now there's so many people living within the bank towers, within the kind of office towers, that there's always people around. Like you used to go downtown at night, there'd be nobody there. Now there's people there. So I think downtown needs to reinvent itself as not a place just for office workers, and like the whole economy was based on like going for lunch. Because they're there, but then they left and went somewhere else. It needs to be reinvented as a 24-hour neighborhood. I think it's lazy to say we got to get the office workers back in there. Like, let's reinvent the place. Maybe the lunch place needs to be open at night. Maybe we need to loosen the zoning and allow for more bars, restaurants. Maybe we need nightclubs back in the city. We have very few places for performance to happen. For bands have a very hard time playing. DJs have a very hard time playing. It's hard to dance in the city. Maybe we should be able to dance downtown again.